Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our webinar, Migrating to dotBANK Domain Names, a step-by-step roadmap for migrating to dotBANK. These will be our presenters today. First, we have Craig Schwartz, FTLD Registry Managing Director, managing dotBANK and .insurance domain registries, also former Chief Registry Liaison with ICANN. We also have Brian Westnedge, Return Path Senior Director, provides DMARC and email fraud protection services. Founded in 1999, an email data company helping banks protect and promote their brands. And then Thomas Barrett, President of EnCirca, leading dotBANK registrar, serving on dotBANK's Security Requirements Working Group. EnCirca was founded in 2001 in Boston, Massachusetts. This will be our roadmap for today's webinar. We'll start off with the dotBANK domain name registration, then setting it up on secure DNS, and then website hosting and email hosting. Then we'll take into consideration marketing, and finally, threat monitoring. So on domain name registration, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Craig.
Thank you, Andrew. We can move on to the next slide. And I do want to thank EnCirca for continuing to host these really helpful webinars. Tom and Andrew have done a really fantastic job of supporting the dotBANK, and we expect the same when .insurance launches in May. And of course to the ICDA for their role in supporting dotBANK and choosing EnCirca to work with. So we're really pleased with what we've seen out of dotBANK so far. A few statistics here. These are through the end of February. We should have some updated numbers through the end of March shortly. But we're looking at a little bit more than 2,560 banks in the United States that have registered domain names. And if you think about the fact that there are a little bit more than 6,000 banks in the U.S., it's a pretty good market penetration so far, and we still would like to increase that. The total number of registrations is just approaching 5,200, probably past that when we look through the end of March. And so we're seeing most banks register about 2.1 names per bank. We've got representation from all the states and are continuing to market here and abroad, particularly looking to make a bigger push in Europe starting soon. Next slide. So who's using, dotBANK? And at the current count, there's a little more than 135 active dotBANK websites. And this does not include the domain names that are parked and redirecting to other top-level domains. We've got a lot more domains that are parked. Here are a few examples of banks that have already migrated over to dotBANK, and I can tell you, having conducted 12 case studies with banks in about the last 2 months, and we're starting to post those on our website, the feedback we continually get is it's far easier than we ever expected, it's not nearly as expensive as we might have expected, and we just don't know what everybody's waiting for. So it's a really great story to tell. Banks love to have an opportunity to message to their customers about how they value protecting their assets and their personally identifiable information. And dotBANK is a really great way to tell that story, to be able to tell your customers that when you land on a dotBANK web domain, you can trust that it is really us, or that when you get an email from a dotBANK email address, that it's legitimate and you can open it without being worried about it containing malware or some other nefarious activity. So we continue to see adoption, and I think the publication of these case stories or these success stories on our websites, and I encourage everyone to take a look at them, will further raise awareness about the value and again tell the story that it's not as hard as people think. Next slide. And I think we've got a couple of slides here with the landing page from bank, this particular bank, Lead Bank, and a quote by Josh Rowland. We've actually got a video of Josh Rowland on our website at register.bank/PR-tools that talks about their experience doing the migration, and again reinforcing it's a no-brainer in telling the right story to your customers. Next slide. And another bank, CNB Bank, and again a quote here from Patty Muldoon talking about their experience, the migration being seamless with EnCirca assisting. And we hear time and time again, particularly with banks that are working with EnCirca, that they've been incredibly helpful in sorting out issues and getting them on a quick migration path. So I encourage you to continue to engage with Andrew and Tom at EnCirca to figure out how to make this best work for your bank. Next slide. And I think we now hand over the mic to Tom Barrett.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for those kind words. Welcome to the ICBA members who are attending today. So I want to get a little more, we'll get into some of the more technical details about how to activate and start using your dotBANK domain name. And so on our roadmap, once you've registered the name, the next step is to activate it. And so let me talk a little bit about the DNS requirements. And if you move to the next slide, at a high level, dotBANK DNS requirements are different from what you might be used to today on .com. First of all, the DNS name servers that you're using must end in dotBANK. And so the way EnCirca is solving this for its customers is that we're taking your own dotBANK domain name and using that to set up your DNS name servers. And in fact, we include that as a free trial with every registration. So if that hasn't been done for you, please let us know. Second of all, before your name can resolve on the World Wide Web, it must have DNSSEC or secure DNS enabled. That's something that requires two parties basically to participate. Your DNS provider needs to sign your zone using DNSSEC, and then your ICANN registrar needs to upload that, record it at the backend registry provider. So obviously if you're using EnCirca for both of those steps, we can handle that for you in one place. But of course you could use someone else for your DNS hosting who can then pass on that information on to EnCirca so we can complete that process. And so that DNSSEC is required even if you're going to add additional subdomains within your dotBANK domain name. So many banks, for example, partner with technology service providers, and so those end up being subdomains off their main website or web domain, and so those have to be DNSSEC enabled as well. And there are today prohibitions against putting into the DNS any records that point outside of the dotBANK zone. And finally, DMARC is required. You must have a valid DMARC record. And so a DMARC, and Brian's going to explain this in more detail, is used for incoming email. If you're not planning to use your dotBANK domain name for email, you still need to put into place a DMARC policy that describes that. I'll let Brian go into more detail. Next slide, please. So once you have your name activated, and again, EnCirca is trying to do this upon approval for all of its customers, you then have to get that name resolving, and you have a few different options there. So on the next slide, the first point to make is SSL is required, or TLS 1.1 or greater is required. And what that means is that you can't simply do a web forwarding from your dotBANK to your .com website unless you have your dotBANK domain name with SSL encryption. So this is something that EnCirca is providing as a service if you're interested. It's not something you typically would find from your typical DNS provider. So it's something to keep in mind if you're simply trying to quickly activate your domain name. You can migrate your website and your email independently of each other, so there's no forced requirement or deadline about migrating from .com to .bank, and you can decide to do just your website initially and have your email traffic follow later. You do need to make sure that if you're running a .bank website that you're using strong cipher suites. In fact, the number one issue we're seeing in terms of compliance issues for our customers is that they're not using the right version of TLS. So for example, TLS 1.0 is not allowed. You have to make sure that you are using the right level of TLS for your active website. And then finally, if you do plan to use .bank for your outgoing email, it needs to be in line with DMARC, which Brian will explain in more detail. So what I'd like to do now is actually introduce Brian. Brian is from ReturnPath, a partner of ours that we're working with, and I'll let him describe DMARC in more detail.
Great, thanks, Tom. Appreciate everybody's time today learning about email security and DMARC. So DMARC is the email trust component of .bank. Very simply, it will prevent malicious actors from pretending to be you and sending email pretending to be from your .bank address to either your customers or your employees. DMARC will ensure that all the emails coming from a spoof .bank domain are blocked before they reach the intended victim. And it is very important. This can help you for .bank email you are sending to your customers, as well as inbound email that is inbound spear phishing potentially, business email compromise. You can leverage DMARC in the same way to protect your employees and your executives from business email compromise. Essentially, DMARC will remove the guesswork on how the receivers of email should handle messages that fail DMARC authentication. I'll get into that a little bit on the next slide, please. So just what we need in our lives is another acronym, but DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance. Just celebrated its 4th anniversary, so fairly new. Kind of open authentication standard if you haven't heard of it. It leverages 2 existing email authentication standards called SPF and DKIM, but it was an industry consortium of major brands, internet service providers, and email data companies like ReturnPath that kind of joined in a industry organization called dmarc.org to promote this. Essentially, it provides domain owners, .bank domain owners, with control over how their .bank domain is used in email, and it provides domain owners with intelligence. So there's reporting information you can get back from ISPs that support the standard on how your .bank traffic is authenticating. So you can make sure that your legitimate .bank email traffic is authenticating, and then block any malicious traffic that purports to be you. And again, it's very important because it's supported by major ISPs like Google, Yahoo, AOL, and Gmail. And it is also supported by a lot of secure email gateways these days, Proofpoint, Cisco Ironport, Semantic Security Cloud. So it's both an outbound and an inbound protection. Next slide, please. So in this case, we're seeing an example of an email spoofing attack. This one in particular leverages the .com of this particular bank. If you go to the next slide, Drew. So in this case, it's using a .com sending domain. Certainly as .bank becomes more known and prevalent in the marketplace and to consumers, as you migrate to using .bank in your email communications, we'll see more and more instances of .bank spoofing as well. And actually, it's an important point to note that you know, most of the banks we've been working with have focused on securing their website first before moving into the email side of .bank. So if that is something that you're doing, DMARC can still be very important in securing your .com, and you can use DMARC in the same way that you'll use it for .bank to secure your .com while you're migrating your email operations over to your .bank. But essentially what DMARC will do is if I'm a malicious actor, I'm mailing from this domain, I have a DMARC reject or quarantine policy in place, this message will not be delivered to the end recipient, whether it's an employee of the bank or a consumer. It literally will be blocked from the inbox, and you know, no action can be taken by the recipient in a negative way that might compromise either your customers or your employees. Next slide, please, Drew. So the specific as follows. So if you're not using your .bank yet, which will be the majority of you for the moment until you, again, migrate your email operations over to using .bank, the requirement is that if the domain is not being used for sending email right now, you must publish a DMARC reject policy. If you use EnCirca for your DNS hosting, they will do this automatically for you, you know, out of the gate after you register your .bank. And there's a reporting option available as well via the return path platform. For your sending .bank domains, you must do one of the following in DNS. So you must support and align with SPF, or you must support and align with DKIM. Certainly our recommendation and the best practice is to use both forms of authentication. However, you can still comply with DMARC by being passing SPF or DKIM authentication as well. And while you're in this testing period, of course, you don't want to block any legitimate mail while you're testing DMARC and while you make sure your .bank outbound mail is authenticating. So you can publish a DMARC policy of none or quarantine during the deployment, but then you must publish a policy of reject for ongoing operations once you've been through this trial period. And with that, I will turn it back to Tom.
Thanks, Brian. And I'll pause here for a second to remind people that if you have any questions, please enter them into the GoToWebinar, and we'll get to all your questions at the end of this webinar. So I want to just talk about some other ongoing types of operational issues once you have your .bank website up and running. Some considerations that obviously that you can't forget about. The first one is marketing. So obviously the point here is that if you do plan to migrate to .bank, we certainly recommend that you start raising awareness among your customer base and your stakeholders 3 to 6 months out. So if you go to the next slide, Andrew. These are obviously some of the major benefits of .bank. The number one benefit we are hearing back is that banks basically are much happier with their .bank domain name because it better reflects their branding than their .com domain name. And I think if that's true for you, your customers will certainly. By using DMARC requirement, you'll certainly improve the deliverability of your email by the major email providers such as Google, AOL, and Microsoft. But most importantly, by eliminating email spoofing and having DNSSEC, you'll start to build consumer trust, and they'll start to see .bank as a more secure extension than .com. The FTLD registry has done a pretty comprehensive job of creating a migration guide, just to remind you that of all the various stakeholders that you want to make sure are made aware of your plan well in advance. of what you plan to do with dotBANK. So some of the more to remember. One of them is you want to start building some search engine history with your dotBANK domain name. And EnCirca actually is providing, as you know, a landing page that will help you to start doing this right away. What's unique about our landing page is that it's fully compliant with all of the dotBANK security requirements. So it not only includes all of the DNS requirements that we talked about earlier, it also has a SSL cert, and it also is compliant in terms of all the valid cipher suites. But your marketing department clearly will have to think through whether or not they think the dot extension means is something of a new branding change for your bank, whether or not it requires a change to your logo, your collateral, your website, etc. I do want to bring something up while we're on this page. We had an interesting problem with one of our clients just last week, where they have a .com domain name, which they are now redirecting to their dotBANK website. As it turns out that the redirection is coming from nonsecure.com to secure.bank, and that's working just fine. But when they did a Google search for their .com website, they discovered some of the HTTPS URLs for the .com website were not redirecting. And that's because their current registrar that they're using for .com and their current DNS provider was not able to redirect the secure URLs for .com over to .bank. And so we were able to give them a solution for their .com domain name so that those Google URLs would in fact redirect to the new .bank website. So it's one of those gotchas that they were surprised to discover after they'd done the migration and didn't realize that the secure.com URLs had not migrated along with it. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about another ongoing operational piece, which is what we call threat intelligence. Again, if you have to make sure your DNS provider has scaled sufficiently to make sure your .bank domain name isn't subject to DDoS attacks. And so for example, certainly EnCirca uses an Anycast DNS network to ensure that, as do many other DNS providers. In terms of website threats, that's one of the benefits of using DNSSEC, and of course working with vendors and registrars that make sure that you're following best practices for security for banking websites. And then finally, on the email threat side, DMARC with SPF alignment or DKIM alignment will help you ensure that spoofing doesn't happen on your .bank domain name. And so you'll want to continue to monitor this through monthly reports. As Brian mentioned earlier, that's a service that ReturnPath is providing to EnCirca customers, but certainly there are other vendors out there as well that will do that. On the next slide, one of the points we'd like to make is, as I said earlier, you don't have to migrate your website and email at the same time. You can certainly, for example, just migrate your website and keep your email where it is. But we strongly recommend that if you do plan to do that, that you put DMARC alignment or SPF or DKIM on both your .com and your .bank websites. And again, we can help you do that with ReturnPath. And of course, if you don't have DNSSEC already on your .com, we certainly recommend you do that as well. And there's certainly if you want to understand where you are today in terms of your .com website, there are several publicly available tools. You simply go to one of these URLs on the screen, and you can type in your existing website, and it will tell you where you stand in terms of DMARC alignment, whether or not your SPF records seem properly aligned, etc. So next slide, please, Andrew. So we've kind of shown you a 5-step roadmap It's obviously somewhat simplistic. EnCirca can help you migrate through these steps, and if you'd like to check references, for example, FTLD has put quite a few case studies on their website, and you can check those and even reach out to some of those folks to see what vendors they've enjoyed working with. But we certainly are here to help you no matter what choices you make in terms of different various vendors here. So if you just want to pick our brain a little bit about secure DNS or secure web hosting or secure email hosting, we're certainly available just a phone call away. And of course, if you want to start to consolidate your .com website, which of course is probably not going away right away with the .bank, we can help you with that as well. So that's just a quick commercial plug. I won't dwell on that. That's really what we had for the webinar today, and would hand this back to Andrew.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Brian and Craig. We do have a couple questions for the webinar. The first question, I'm going to jump right in, is, Tom, actually, could you please mute your microphone? I'm hearing a bit of an echo. So the first question would be, how do recipients know that an email contains a DMARC record?
I'll take that one, Andrew. So the recipient won't necessarily know that the .bank domain is using DMARC. It will be kind of transparent to them. The receiving entity who gets the email, let's say Google or Yahoo, will do a DNS lookup on the sending .bank domain and see if there's a DMARC record in place. So it's very similar to, and just as straightforward as an SPF record for the most part. If I'm Yahoo, I'll look up this message that's coming from examplebank.bank. If examplebank.bank has a DMARC record in the DNS, there's a few things I can do. If the policy of the DMARC record is none, I'll just deliver the mail as usual, subject to any other reputation or content filtering checks I do. If the policy of the DMARC record is reject, this is where the real power is. If the message passes SPF and DKIM authentication because it's a legitimate mail from you, the sender, the legitimate .bank, it will be delivered, to the recipient. If the policy is reject and it fails both SPF and DKIM, the message will be rejected and it'll never be delivered to the end user, whether or not that's your customer or your employees. So it's very powerful, but it is transparent, or not visible to the end user unless they do a DNS lookup. Although I should mention, sorry, Andrew, I cut you off there. I should mention that some of the major ISPs are moving to a world where they will display in their user interfaces whether or not an email is authenticating correctly. So some sort of trust icon or key. Gmail came out last month and said they will start displaying a question mark avatar icon in their UI when a message is not using either SPF or DKIM. So, that trend will continue. We'll see the other major webmail providers do something similar, both a negative potentially trust icon if the message is not authenticating correctly, and potentially a positive trust icon if it is authenticating correctly.
And as a quick follow-up to that, is it common for financial institutions to experience issues with email delivery, such as recipient blocking email as junk or spam?
It is. In our experience here at ReturnPath, our original mission here was, we're 17 years old now, but our original mission was to help legitimate marketers get their email delivered to the inbox. And then over time, it has evolved, and spam and phishing and spoofing has become more of a problem. We're also focused on keeping illegitimate email out of the inbox as well. But yes, we would say, we work with many legitimate email marketers who do experience deliverability problems with their legitimate mail traffic. And there's a number of reasons for that. Could be list quality, it could be content, could be sending reputation of the IP addresses, Potentially could be authentication issues that'll be remedied via the visibility you get into email authentication from DMARC. So there's a whole host of reasons why legitimate mail may not be delivered to the end user. Authentication and DMARC could be one piece of that, but certainly that is kind of one of our core areas of expertise here.
Awesome. Sounds good. I'm going to jump over to SSL certificates. In regards to redirecting an unsecured.com website to dotBANK, are two separate SSL certificates required, one for the .com and one for the .bank?
So I can take this. You can hear me okay, Andrew? This is Tom. So
Great.
it's not required to have an SSL on your .com to redirect your .com over to .bank. It is required to have SSL on your .bank if you're redirecting from .bank to .com. And the example I gave earlier, where a bank migrated from their .com website to their .bank website, for some reason when they did that redirection with their existing registrar, it did not do the redirection for the SSL component of the .com website. And so the way we solved that problem actually is that we are now hosting a SSL-enabled landing page for their .com domain name. They didn't have to change their current website, but for the SSL component, we are hosting it and then redirecting that over to their .bank domain name.
Okay, and for clarification issues, you mentioned it is possible to redirect a .bank to a .com?
That is possible. So I don't know if you folks have probably noticed we've put up a landing page for all the .bank domain names, and currently the landing page has a button that says click here to go to our existing .com website. And that landing page does have a SSL digital cert already configured for your domain name. And so we are able to put in the right commands if you want to bypass that landing page and go straight to your .com. Because we already have your .com, your .bank domain name SSL enabled, we can do a straight redirect if that's what you desire.
Great, thank you. And regarding redirects, there was a bullet mentioned early in the webinar. For clarification, what exactly does it mean that there is no pointing outside of the .bank zone?
You want me to take this, Craig, or do you want to take it?
Well, I don't mind taking it. Andrew, with that, and for the person who's asking what that's about is, there's a prohibition against aliasing, or there's a current prohibition against aliasing outside of .bank to another domain. And aliasing is different than redirection, because in redirection, the URL in the browser actually displays one URL, and then when you redirect, you go to a second. With aliasing to the consumer, it looks as if they're still in the same place, but they're actually, rather than in the .com domain, they're now in some other place, could be a .com. So there's a current restriction against aliasing outside of the zone. I suspect, and I don't know if Tom mentioned this earlier, but I'll bring it up now, it's anticipated that some of the security requirements for domain names outside of .bank and .insurance will undergo a modification pending FTLD board review and approval next week. None of the requirements for .bank and .insurance are changing as you know them now, but we do foresee being in a position to enable banks to use some security and other types of services that they currently have hosted on a .com name in their .bank space, subject to those .com URLs now being subject to some of our security requirements. We're putting the cart a little bit before the horse right now and talking about it, but I would say stay tuned for some information within the next 30 or so days that will update the security requirements. And certainly if you're working with EnCirca, they'll have this information readily available and can help you with questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. Regarding the website hosting, what providers are banks choosing for hosting that meets the TLS requirements?
So this is Tom again. And so there obviously the TLS requirement is that you need to have not only an SSL cert at the right standard, but in addition to that, you have to make sure that you're via the prohibited cipher suites from accessing the website. And there's a fairly detailed list on the FTLD website. EnCirca can send you the list as well. FTLD will basically runs a nightly scan to make sure that websites are in compliance with this. If EnCirca could probably help you. We are providing a secure web server, so I know we're doing it. We don't have who else is able to do it yet, but I'm sure there's a few out there that are able to.
Great, thank you. And do you have any suggestions for those that have current website providers that cannot support dotBANK, how they would work around while their website provider gets up to par?
Yeah,
So this,
go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. Well, I was going to say, if you look at our roadmap, the first step obviously is the DNS requirement. EnCirca is basically making that happen for all of our customers now. In terms of the secure web hosting and email hosting, we realize that you've got established vendors that you'd prefer to work with. There are some potential workarounds. I think every case seems to be different in terms of, so it's not a single answer, I think. It really depends on who you're using today and whether or not they're a week or month or 2 years away from coming into compliance with the. You want to add something, Craig?
I was just going to say, and I would echo the sentiments you just made, Tom, but I would also say that you need to do your homework before you put in time and energy to launching your dotBANK website. Make sure that the service providers you have or the hosting provider you have can actually meet the requirements. Because what we're seeing now is some banks have gone ahead and launched, but now they're out of compliance right out of the gates, which isn't good for them and it's not good for us. And it's requiring a lot of work on a remediation plan. And so as much as it might pain me to say this, I'd rather you take the time to do it right from the onset than rushing to get it up, only to realize that you've got some major technological issues that could wind up in the long run taking it back down. So better to be safe at the onset and to ensure that either the vendors you have can support the requirements as they are, or to give yourself some time to figure out what vendor can actually be helpful to you.
And Craig, I'll add one more thing. If there are banks out there who are pretty far along and just want another set of eyes to check to make sure they're in compliance, you can feel free to give EnCirca a call. We run our own scans as well, and so we could tell you fairly quickly if we can spot anything that doesn't look right for you.
Great. A suggestion that one bank received from their web host provider was to simply redirect the .bank to the .com. Would that be in compliance?
So this is.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, go ahead, Tom, but I didn't hear the question.
I can answer this if you want, Craig. So the problem is, the short answer is no, it's not in compliance. And the reason is, I've worked over the years with a variety of DNS service providers. They all have something called a web forwarding record that allows you to do a redirection. That is not in compliance because it tries to do a redirection before establishing an SSL cert on the .bank domain name. And so you cannot, and as you know, but as you well know, you don't want to use a catch-all, a wildcard cert. You want a cert that is specific to your bank's organization. So you need an SSL cert first installed in your .bank domain name, which is done at the web server level. Once you have that in place, then at the web server level, you can do the redirect. Typically it's done in your .htaccess file. What you do not want to happen is have the redirect happen within your DNS provider itself, because that will not be SSL enabled. So I hope that makes sense.
Okay, and that seems like a great segue. Just to reiterate, please, we have one bank that wants to set up an auto redirect from the .bank landing page that EnCirca has provided to their .com website.
Right, Andrew. So that's exactly what we're, if you've bought our DNS service, and that's exactly the service we're providing. So just to be clear, that means that we have an SSL cert that we've generated for your domain name, and we can skip the landing page that you see today and go straight to your .com website if that's what you want.
Awesome, thank you. We have two more questions. First is, we have one bank that uses a third-party provider, Office 365, and they're having issues getting into compliance with .bank.
So I'll take that one, Andrew. And we first learned of the Office 365 issue in November when a service provider actually brought it to us, because our current security an MX record out to a .com name. The modified security requirements that I mentioned perhaps 10 or so minutes ago will enable the services of a web-hosted company, an email-hosted service provider, such as Google or Microsoft. So I would say have a little bit of patience, and again, probably within the next 30 or so days, you'll likely see modifications to the requirements that will alleviate.
Sounds good. And as one final question, can someone, whether it be EnCirca or Craig or Brian, give an estimate on the pricing from start to finish on getting a .bank domain name into compliance?
Tom, if you don't mind, I'll take that, simply because we've been doing all these case studies and talking with banks, and what we consistently hear is that purchase of the domain name itself has been the most expensive part of the process, and that the other services that need to be purchased in order to be in compliance, whether it's the DNSSEC piece or the name server piece, you're probably talking maybe a couple $1,000s a year, or $2,000 a year or less. We've actually heard figures much lower than that, $400 to $500 per year, plus the cost of the domain name. So as I said, I think at the onset, banks are telling us that it's been far less expensive than they ever thought it would be, which is obviously really great news to hear and to share.
DMARC is an open standard and is free, so certainly you can receive DMARC reporting yourself, the XML files, and interpret them yourself, or you can use a third-party like Return Path to kind of interpret the reports, give you alerting, and provide an interface for viewing the reports. But as you mentioned, the cost is fairly nominal in comparison to the original registration fee.
Great. That will conclude our webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. For the next steps, EnCirca is offering free consultations for all 5 steps of the dotBANK roadmap. You can learn more at EnCirca.com/bank. At that same URL, you'll be able to find a copy of today's slides and a recording of the webinar, which will be uploaded shortly. All general inquiries and callback requests can be requested via bankhelp@EnCirca.com. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you to the panelists, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.